Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Yeah. This is a new Ferridian. I'm an old Ferridian.
Yes.
And so, Sean, you want to talk a little bit about who you are and where you came from?
Yes, sir.
You're a Texan by,
Well, first of all, let me say it's a real honor to be here with you this morning because since my first week on the job at the Delta Music Museum, I kept hearing your name, and most of it was very flattering.
that's good.
I just want to let you
Could have
know
been
that
bad.
they're still talking good things about you back home.
Yeah, in Ferriday, sometimes it wasn't always the good side they remember.
But that's okay. That's okay.
When you grow up in a place, they remember when you weren't always the good kid.
That's right. That's right. And they're going to try to point out to you
Yeah.
what you need to be doing.
Yeah.
But yes, sir. I have been fortunately. I've been very lucky to be at the Delta Music Museum, going on about 2.5 years now.
That's great.
Great retirement job. I love it. I'm a lifelong musician. Originally from Port Arthur, Texas, Janis Joplin's hometown.
All right.
And when we got ready to retire, we were looking for a place to go inland to get away from the hurricanes there in Port Arthur. And so we wound up, our kids told us about Natchez, Mississippi, and Vidalia and Ferriday. So we went there for a visit, fell in love with it, and been there ever since, and I don't think we're going anywhere.
Yeah. Well, there are very few people who are, we used to say, very few people are born in Ferriday. I was born in Vidalia, so I was always kind of an outsider.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 7 miles away. And but on the other hand, most people come to Ferriday and stay. And drifted in with one thing or another. And so people come to the town, the little town, from a lot of different directions, a lot of different routes. And so so you want to tell us a little bit about the museum and then
The museum, there's a lot of really good things going on at the museum now. We just finally completed the first new exhibit in a decade or so at the museum. We have now completed the Haney's Big House and Mr. William Haney's exhibit at the museum, something I'm really, really proud of. As folks know, and if you don't, I'm certainly going to tell you, that Haney's Big House was a very famous juke joint there in Ferriday. And for many years, there's a lot of folks in the community that wanted to give Haney's Big House and Mr. William Haney, the owner, wanted to give them their due for the great contributions that Mr. Haney made. And then, of course, Haney's Big House, being a really world-renowned juke joint in Ferriday, folks like Little Richard, Ray Charles, B.B. King, on, Ike and Tina Turner.
Muddy Waters.
Muddy Waters, Red Fox.
Yeah.
It just goes on and on. They perform there, and what I try to emphasize to folks who come through the museum and visit the exhibit, I said, you got to remember that these folks were all in their prime when they were coming to Ferriday, because this is in the 40s through the 50s, and of course Haney's Big House burned down in the mid-60s. But imagine all of those, the biggest stars in the world coming through Ferriday. Mr. Haney would pack that place, as you well know, and a really exciting opportunity to go ahead and get that exhibit and
That's great.
and start showing it to the
Yeah.
public.
There's another thing in the well, the museum, the first part of the museum is in the old post office.
That's correct.
And the old post office has the WPA murals.
Beautiful, beautiful
And
building.
I hope you can get a little grant money for them sometime.
I-
But anyway, the post office itself is a pretty remarkable place.
It
And the-
really is.
Architecturally, it's in good shape, and the murals are beautiful.
And you know, Pete, I've discovered since being at the museum that people will find any excuse to travel around the country and find things that they're interested in to look at. You mentioned the mural in the old post office there in the museum. Well, there are folks that travel the country just to look at those murals.
Yeah.
Because, of course, as most folks know, back in the day, part of the New Deal, when the federal government built a building, they always hired local artists to come in and do a painting and to represent local life. And of course, in the museum in Ferriday, we have a mural, and there's folks that come there just to see that mural and then move on to the next town.
Yeah.
And I mean, to the next federal building that's
Yeah,
still,
so
if they're
it was
still
a-
operating.
It was a nice thing to happen to the post office. The whole idea, the concept of the museum, I don't even know where that started. But put it in the post office was a great idea. The Arcade Theater, which stood right next door to it, it burned, the first one burned, and it was replaced in the early 50s. And it stood empty a long time. And but it's pretty unique too.
It
Lots of
it
people
really
play
is.
music there over the years, and it's been a good venue. Hezekiah Early opened it, and and so we had a little blues evening just to open it up.
That's amazing.
And then there's been a steady stream of people. It drifted off into country music. It's still kind of into country music. Dr. Tommy Haley, who teaches here with me, his brother plays there. They're from up in the hills, and but there's still in and out different musics in that place. And the town has lots of different musical traditions.
It does.
So I grew up across the street. When I was a little kid, across the street from the post office, is a street called 3rd Street.
Sure.
Okay. There's a whole row of tenant houses down 3rd Street. So my grandparents and all of my relatives and all of Jerry Lee's relatives and Mickey Gilly was his mother and father and sister lived in the house with us. It was a split shotgun house. And
I like the fact that you used Mickey Gilly's real name.
yeah, he's a Gilly. He's a Gilly. He's only a Gilly in Texas.
Well, being a Texan, that's all I ever knew. But
Yeah.
I got corrected very early
Yeah. In Ferriday, you get
when I
corrected.
got to Ferriday. In fact, it was some of Mickey's family that was coming through.
Yeah.
And I was doing my spiel like I always do, had no idea who I was talking to. So I mentioned Mickey Gilly's name, and they said, well, you know that's his stage name.
Yeah.
I said, no, but I should know that.
Well,
They said, well, the name's pronounced Gilly.
yeah.
And then I said, well, of course, that makes perfect sense. That's
Yeah.
the French pronunciation.
Well, Mickey and Jerry Lee's grandmother was my grandfather's sister, so she's my great aunt, and so we all kind of grew up together. They all moved to, like everybody moves to Ferriday. They all moved to Ferriday in the late 30s, early 40s, from up in Franklin Parish, Richland Parish, and they all came as sharecroppers, most of them. The kids came to town and started businesses. The old people, well, not all of them. Jerry Lee's fathers kept on sharecropping right up till they hit music.
Yes.
And so they farmed. But they moved to town when the farming got bad, and they got too old to farm. And so we all wound up on 3rd Street. It was a pretty tough little neighborhood. We lived next door to the McLaughlins.
Well, you had to be tough
Yeah, it was
to
a
make
good-
it through those times.
It was a good street, but they were good people, but it was a poor neighborhood. And
I mentioned to folks, Doctor, that when they come in and I guess probably the number one question that I get asked by folks from all over the world, and we do get folks from all over the world, the number one question that I get asked is, how did all this happen in this tiny little town?
Yeah.
You've got 3 double cousins, they're first and second cousins, Reverend Jimmy Swaggart, Mickey Gilly, and of course the killer Jerry Lee. Well, how did all that happen that they went on to have all had their own international fame. And so I kind of try to fill in my own blanks with my answer by saying that, well, you have to remember that the conditions folks lived in back in the day. There was no industry, there was no fast food restaurants to work at or anything. And so you had to, and you please correct me, and I hope you will, you had to find a way to make your way.
Yeah.
And I try to explain to folks that when Jerry's family and his neighbors, and when they all discovered that he had this talent, and with that talent, you could actually get a few cash dollars to bring home, putting the hat out or whatever, and Jerry Lee playing his piano on the street. Well, if you could make a few dollars, that was a big deal.
Yeah, it was a big deal.
It was a big deal, so that the music had value, and that talent had value, so you got encouraged.
There's a great deal of ambivalence about that music. You weren't supposed to make dollars. And so the music was supposed to belong to God. And so all those boys started in that one little church, which is still in Ferriday.
It's still there.
And they all started in church. They'd all tell you that
Exactly.
they were here. And so they were not supposed to sing for money. And so they started out doing tent revivals, and they did some street corner preaching. And Jimmy Lee said one time, I heard him say that the hardest thing he ever did was come back to Ferriday and give a sermon on the corner, because everybody knew him.
Yes.
And so his youth there was he was always in and out of trouble.
Yes.
But he came home to preach. And so they started out, and it was all religion. There was a lot of ambivalence in their families about them making money.
And do you believe it's true that Jerry Lee did struggle with that aspect of playing?
Well, his family did.
That early rock and roll?
I know his mother did. His mother really didn't want him to play except in church, and so there was always that. And I'm sure they carried that with them. Several times he's been quoted saying that, and so I'm sure he did.
I bet he did.
But then they started playing for fun, and that was different. But they all came from out in the country, and they moved to town when the country failed. Sharecropping just went out about the time of World War II. Things were wearing out in the country, and so that kind of music developed out of basically country music and out of gospel music, white gospel music.
Exactly, and I believe that's what separates that music from everything else, is that country and gospel roots.
Yeah, it's good. But when it hit Ferriday, it hit the blues. Ferriday is probably what now, 30-40% Afro-American. When I was a kid, it was probably higher than that.
Yeah.
But Ferriday came with the railroad. It's a new South town. It's an I-town. Louisiana Avenue runs to the depot.
Exactly.
And the town developed along the railroad, the business town. And some merchants from Natchez bought a plantation called Helena Plantation. And they divided up lots for businesses along that front street. And Louisiana led them off into Highway 84 to the west. So it was a kind of industrialized little place. It had a huge sawmill, cut cypress. It had a roundhouse. It was an industrial roundhouse for the railroad where the trains turned, and it had machine shops all around that. And then they had a huge plantation store complex. It had the first mall in the country.
Wow.
And there was a Jewish family named Pasternak.
Yes, that's a prominent name in Natchez as well.
Yeah,
where I
there's
live.
the whole half of downtown Ferriday was in this one store. And so on one end of the store, they had a clothing store. On the other end of the store, they had a grocery store. And then there was a dry goods store in there. And hardware store, a toy, a dime store in there.
Their family home is still there
Their
in
family home was
Ferriday.
down the other side of town. So that you could go in that building and stay in the stores and never get out.
Wow.
And Saturday night on downtown was plantation night, so people paid their labor, paid their people in town, and so that they'd all come and park on that front street and pay everybody, and then everybody go party downtown.
I found an interesting fact about Haney's Big House and Mr. Haney, that juke joint's biggest night was Sunday night. Mm-hmm. By design, Mr. Haney would book his biggest acts on a Sunday night because Mr. Haney figured out that nobody else was open, of course, but he had to figure out how he could get that big talent to get off the highway, Highway 61, the Blues Highway, for those folks traveling from Chicago to New Orleans or Baton Rouge or from Memphis. Those big acts would perform in those cities, and then Sunday was a travel day. But over the years, as I've been told, the word got out that you could make a payday at Haney's Big House in Ferriday.
Yeah.
And so they would get off the highway, cross the bridge, come down to the big house, and Mr. Haney would have it packed, spilling out into the street.
It's a kind of famous place in Afro-American traditional culture here. Alcorn College in Mississippi, a big Afro-American college, a black college.
Sure.
And almost all of the black kids from Northeast Louisiana went to Alcorn, and didn't make it to Southern, or
Right.
didn't even stay at Grambling. They went to Alcorn, and they always stopped at Haney's Big House. And so the weekend was when they traveled. You know, they'd go back to Alcorn on Sunday.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you can talk to, in any community here, people remember Haney's Big House. Hezekiah Early said he learned to play drums sitting on the back steps, and some guy gave him 2 sticks, and he said, I was playing with 2 little sticks, and this guy came out and handed me a set of drumsticks. I said, why don't you have some real drumsticks? He said, and the next thing was they invited me in to play with the band, and he played with that band, the house band at Haney's, until he grew up. And so there's a very strong Afro-American musical tradition in the town.
Well, you mentioned Hezekiah Early, and of course he's a renowned drummer and harmonica player from that part of the world. And in doing our research, we inducted Hezekiah Early into our Hall of Fame at the Delta Music Museum. And in doing so, I found some photographs of Hezekiah Early. And everybody will remember this contraption that Bob Dylan had when he was playing his guitar. He always had this thing that held his harmonica, okay? And we thought that was strange enough back in the day. But Hezekiah Early, who played drums and harmonica, in order for him to do both, of course, he had to have one of those. And I bet you he had his before Dylan, because his was made out of duct tape and baling wire, and he would just somehow, and I saw these photographs, and it's all tape and everything, and he's just wailing away on the drums and the harmonica. It's quite a sight. And Hezekiah is still alive, living in Natchez.
Yeah. He had a partner. I remember his first name. Well, he had a nickname, so I'm not sure his last name. Anyway, we called him Poochie. So Hezekiah and Poochie played together. Poochie played guitar. It started out with a little group. Pee Wee Whitaker had a band, and Hezekiah played drum and harmonica with Pee Wee, and Poochie joined the band. I think he played second guitar, and they had a bass player named Baker from Waterproof.
James Baker.
Yeah, James.
That was Hezekiah and the House Rockers.
Yeah. Hezekiah went for the House Rocker. James Baker became his bass guitar player, but Pee Wee was an interesting character. Pee Wee played a saxophone, And we put out a record at the Louisiana Folklife Center here. We put out a record of Pee Wee's band. And Pee Wee and the House Rockers turned into Hezekiah and the House
Wow.
Rockers. That turned into Glenn McLaughlin and the House Rockers.
I love all that lineage.
And so these bands kind of grow out of one another. And Pee Wee played for the Barnum and Bailey Circus in the circus band. Barnum and Bailey wintered in Mississippi and up north of Natchez. And so the band stayed there, but he actually was a kind of Ferridian. But he had this really cool band. So I think Shane still got some tapes and some discs of the band.
Pee Wee Whitaker, and of course in our induction into the Hall of Fame at the museum for Pee Wee Whitaker, which he was in that first class
Right.
of the Hall of Fame, along with Jerry Lee and Swaggart and Mickey Gilley. He's a trombone player in the museum.
I'm sorry, he is a trombone player, not a sax, but a trombone player. That's
But apparently he was like one of the most traveled musicians
Yeah.
anywhere around there because he played in those minstrel shows over in Europe. And
Yeah.
Crazy.
They went to Europe. I forgot. I saw the last time he came to the Ferriday festival we had, and actually he got sick the second one and never got really over it. He had a stroke.
Yeah.
And but they went to Europe, and so he came back and he told me, he said, "Well, I've been to," he said, "I've been to Jesus' house." And Hezekiah finally explained to me that he got on the plane in Paris and they flew to Rome. And so he decided Rome was Jesus' house.
Makes sense.
But he had a great time. So they played in Rome, they played in Paris, they played all over Europe, played in London. It's a great band. And so that whole blues tradition is on one side of town, and this other blues tradition, that sort of blues country gospel tradition on the other side. There were 40 churches in Ferriday when I was a kid.
Wow.
And so there was all kinds of gospel music, and then the people who came in out of the country, who became the first town people, moved off of farms, and they're mostly sharecroppers, and they started all kinds of small businesses and worked at the mill, worked at a lot of them worked for the railroad, and did whatever the town could do. The first merchants were Jewish people and the Sicilians, and the Italian families moved. And so all along the front street by the railroad, you had stores, grocery stores, a fish market, and then the Pasternak
That's amazing
Mall.
to think about now.
So the town kind of developed around that little nucleus. It divided up. It was Jim Crow South, and so the south side of town, the east side of town, was mostly African American. The west side of town was sometimes called Calhoun Quarters. Was mostly people who moved out of rural areas into the town. Two big areas. One is Black River, which is in western Concordia, Catahoula Parish. Small farmers moved to town, and from there, and then got jobs, young kids. And then all of the Swaggart, Gilley, Hampton family, my mother's family, they all moved from Franklin, Richland Parish, came down and settled. And eventually they all got married. And so there are lots of cousins. And,
Yes, a lot of close cousins.
One of my cousins is a genealogist, and he said, well, there's this predilection in the family to marry cousins. And it went back for generations.
That's why Jerry Lee didn't understand the big deal.
No, it wasn't a big deal.
People said that you married your cousin.
She was a second cousin, third cousin. She wasn't a close cousin, and he didn't understand it all.
No.
They were
He had that famous quote of, "Hey, I plumb married the girl."
Yeah.
Well, that's not what everybody was upset about. When you mentioned the 40 churches in Ferriday, it makes me think about there's a famous photograph in Sun Studios in Memphis. Y'all have probably seen it. It's called the $1 Million Quartet. And it's Elvis at the piano, Jerry Lee in one corner, Johnny Cash on one end, and Carl Perkins in the middle with his guitar. And I read somewhere about Jerry Lee's quote about that whole time in Sun Studios with that $1 million quartet. They asked him, reporters said, well, that had to be a lot of fun with that much talent, surrounded and everybody having fun and y'all jamming. He said, yeah, but, Elvis and I are Pentecostals, so we got along great. That Johnny Cash is Baptist, he just couldn't keep up with us.
Yeah, Johnny Cash he's right.
Yeah, he's right, that's right.
The whole beat is different. So the town developed, by the 1960s, the town fell into hard times. So a lot of the town changed, and the schools changed. But the town they all grew up in, the town that sort of spawned the interest that you find at the arcade, that music particularly, I think, drew people to the town, and it's been there a long time.
We're hoping that they're going to come back. There's lots of activity at the museum. Folks are surprised when I tell them that we average, close to 6,000 visitors a year to the Delta Music Museum in Ferriday, because people come from all over the world. Because let's face it, Jerry Lee's the big draw, and he's still very big in Europe. But as you said, Pete, yeah, they kicked him out one time, but now they love him.
Yeah,
but,
they forget.
That's what time does, yes.
Yeah, they forget.
But we're hopeful that, because we're doing a lot of renovations at the Arcade Theater as well, which is our performance space. And so we're really encouraged. And the Louisiana legislature just designated downtown Ferriday an entertainment district to try to get back to its some of its early roots.
How liquid is that?
Well, it's not liquid at all right now.
Oh, well,
but,
it's not the old town.
That's right. So it's a modern entertainment. But we're hopeful that with that, we're fixing up the storefronts because the museum and the arcade are the shining stars down there in downtown. If you go through downtown Ferriday at night, the arcade we still have the big marquee and the old neon sign that every hailstorm comes through, destroys it, and we have to rebuild it. But that's okay. We always go back. They try to talk us into going with faux neon every time. We said, there's going to be nothing faux about this place. So we're hoping the rest of downtown can kind of pick up, and then maybe, because people come to the museum, they always ask, is there anywhere to eat down here? And I said, well, there's Big John's Burgers right behind us, but that's it. But we're hoping we can get some little cafes going and stuff.
Yeah, that'd be good. Well, the new Haney's Big House, right, there was a big warehouse complex went with the depot, so one of them has turned into a kind of a...
It's a community center, basically.
Kind of a community center place, and so it's got Haney's name. Now, Will Haney was a pretty interesting fellow. He was a sharecropper's kid, and he moved to town. He was entrepreneurial, and he's much undersung in terms of the development of Ferriday because he put a lot of money into the town. And so the town had people who developed areas of it one way or another. But things just came together there. It was the highways intersected there, the railroad intersected there. Vidalia was a parish seat. It's 7 miles away across the river from Natchez, and it's always been under the hill on the Louisiana side, but it never developed much of a town.
Just a lot of commerce along the highway.
Yeah, the highway filled up. Those were all plantations. In the 1950s, when we grew up there, that was solid cotton, almost all the way to Ferriday. So there are about 6 or 8 plantations.
Now it's solid fast food restaurants.
Yeah, now it's all fast food or filling stations.
Yes.
The highway between Ferriday and Vidalia and Natchez, it's got more traffic than almost any place in the state. and I've never figured out where anybody goes.
Yes, you have to pay attention. That's my commute every morning, so.
And when you pass Ferriday, coming west over here, not much traffic. When you pass Ferriday going north to Monroe, not much traffic. But back and forth across that road, I haven't
Let
figured
me
it out.
recommend to you to drive the speed limit if you're going that way.
Yeah, and Ferriday
Because that's where
definitely
revenue
drives-
comes from in all those little towns.
Ferriday has one good reputation: you can get a ticket. And if
Oh,
you-
and they're about to do those, Pete, they're about to do those red light cameras
oh, what happened to
in Ferriday because I guess it's Clayton maybe up the highway there where Jerry Lee's buried.
Yeah,
So
Clayton
they're-
has one spotlight, one traffic light.
But they've got about 5 traffic cops.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yes, they do.
And they all sit out there with these little guns and they don't even stop you. You just get this thing in the mail, and I'm a recipient of one of those love notes and couldn't believe that. And I got 48 and a 40. You know, I said, hey, I thought you were going to give us 10 miles an hour.
Yeah.
No, they don't play.
No, it's a funny, they don't have much income except for traffic. But they have a lot of traffic, so they do pretty well. Louisiana Folklife Center here, Dr. Don Hatley and I decided one year that we should have a community festival. We should take the festival away from the university setting, which is this kind of alien place to have a festival, to be perfectly honest with you. There ain't no beer here, and people are comfortable here and safe here, I think, and so when we started, we put it here. But then we decided we'd have it someplace, and he said, where do you think we could do it? And I said, well, I grew up in Ferriday, and Fariday's just one big festival. This is what people do in Ferriday. And they play music, they go to church, they're big honky-tonks downtowns. You know, people have stuff, they do stuff. And he said, well, let's go over there and talk to everybody. And so we did. And amazing things happened. We found Jerry Lee's, I guess, his first piano. It was in an abandoned Afro-American school. And somebody painted it pink. I think it may have started out pink. But we put it in a pickup truck and brought it uptown, and people played. We found Pee Wee's band, and they played.
Oh, that's amazing.
We started looking for craftspeople. People made all kinds of stuff there. There was a barber who was also a Pentecostal preacher, and Brother Massey. Brother Massey brought his barber chair up to the old high school and set it up in the yard. He cut hair all day for free.
I'm going to have to remember that for our next festival.
Yeah, see, maybe Glenn will do it. But we always had 2 barbershops or 3 barbershops, and Reverend Massey had a choir, not a choir, quartet. He had a gospel quartet, and they traveled all over the South. And he cut hair during the week, preached on Sunday, and he wasn't atypical. Glenn McLaughlin, who was mayor for a long time, had a little band called the House Rockers, and his folks, his mother came from Germany. His father married over there in World War II, so they sang in German, and they sang a lot, and they drifted around the state. People knew them, so he comes out of a musical tradition, but that's a Catholic musical tradition, which is kind of rare in the South, and so the ones of us who grew up Catholic didn't have much music. We didn't play much.
Well, I certainly would be open if you wanted to revive that festival tradition in downtown Ferriday.
I don't think I'm able. It was a big job.
Well, I will do all your heavy lifting.
Don't say that. You regret it. Ask anybody. There's Robert. Don't ask Robert that. He'll have you pick up a house, you know. But we had the old school. The old school had been closed. There was a grammar school, high school in town, and they replaced it with a new school uptown. And so they gave us a school, and we had a gymnasium, and we had the high school, we had the grammar school, and we emptied all of that out put it into exhibit space, performance space, and we used all local talent. everybody we could get. And it was a great festival. The second time, they tried it again. We wore everybody out. And the second time, the state tried it, and they hired some young people to put it on. And it had rained on them, and it was tough. But it worked. But they didn't have the local people, didn't have the
Right.
muscle. And yeah, do it again.
Okay, I'm for it.
I'll come pat my foot, as the old folks say.
Okay.
Where are we time-wise? Where are we? Oh, well, okay.
Anybody have any questions for Dr. Pete or
Or
myself?
for Sean?
Yeah.
I hope so. And,
What's the population of Ferriday now compared to back then? Do you know?
when I was a kid, it was about 5,000. That's the number that
I
ran
think
the
it's a
country.
little over 3 now.
It's smaller. It dropped. It dropped in the 60s. That whole part of the Delta, or what we call the Delta, it's the upper Delta. That whole part of the Delta began losing population in the 60s. 60s was a kind of chaotic time. And integration came, and integration didn't work well, particularly not in Ferriday. And it's worked out great since, but it wasn't good then. And Natchez had lots of violence. We had problems. And in the 50s, new things started coming in, like paper mills and asbestos plants and tire plants, and a lot of competition with labor. So it was tough, and a lot of people left, and they didn't come back. But it was a booming little town in the 40s. I remember that-
Still a lot of pride there, though.
Yeah.
There's
Oh,
a
yeah.
lot of pride in Ferriday,
It's a-
Concordia Parish in
it's-
general. But
It's a proudful place, and for everybody, black, white, in between, it's a special place, and Ferriday more particularly, I think,
I agree.
because it was a new town, and the old towns were plantation dominated. They'd been there since colonial times. They're like Natchez, and the new people kind of clustered to themselves and built their own little culture within that. And it's a pretty neat kind of place. The other places had happened in the South, but not quite as well, I
Right.
think. It didn't stay there like that. So he brought new people into the paper mill in the 50s, but they came from the same roots, the same place that other people came. So it's a strong little place. Great place for a museum.
It is, and always have to tell the story about, I was speaking to a Lions Club or something, one of the civic groups, and at the end, when I was doing the question and answer thing, there was an elected official from Vidalia, who will go unnamed, who said to me, Sean, why don't we think about getting you out of that old building there in downtown Ferriday and building you something up on the highway up here. I said, well, sir, I'm open to any ideas that the community has, and did my best political tap dance for him. And I said, but some people, the idea of a museum is to preserve not only the old spaces or places, but the old spaces. And those are the streets that Jerry Lee and Brother Swaggart and Mickey and so many others, those are the streets they walked on, and people like that. Reverend Swaggart at his megachurch in Baton Rouge, they have a travel group. And a couple of times a year, they'll come through Ferriday and come to the museum, and they don't stay long in the museum because they want to go out on the street. Because Brother Swaggart, in his sermons, always talks about different spots in downtown Ferriday The most famous of which is where he was saved. He talks about standing at the ticket booth at the arcade theater, and I don't know if this part is made up or what, but he supposedly was there with his two cousins, Mickey and Jerry Lee. Mickey and Jerry Lee paid their quarter, went in, and it was Brother Swaggart's turn, put his quarter down, and the ticket machine jammed. Now, this was like, and so this was a message, according to Brother Swaggart, it's a message to him that was probably a movie he wasn't supposed to see. So he took his quarter back, according to him, took his quarter back, went next door to the soda fountain, got him an ice cream. So that travel group, they all want to go to that ticket booth and stand there, which it's still there, because even though the arcade has been rebuilt, the facade is still the same. And they stand there in line, they stand, say a prayer, let the next person step in, say their prayer. So you got to respect that from people, you know? And I don't think it would be the same if it was all just video at some
No, it's not the
place up
same.
on the highway.
No.
you know?
That's the other thing about Ferriday. Music in Ferriday was live music.
Yeah,
And it's the one difference, I think, that it's very hard to duplicate that. Media doesn't do it. You guys listen today. It's just different when it's live music. It can be bad live music, but it's still alive.
Somebody's playing it.
And
That's right.
somebody's up there playing it. And if they're your kin folks, that's even better. You take a little pride because we're up there. It's a special kind of thing to do. And so, yeah, Faraday's been lucky in a lot of ways. Somebody said it's unlucky in a lot of ways. It's always had a high level of poverty. It's not a rich place. So sometimes people will come down there and they'll look around and say, where do the rich people live? And we just kind of smile. There ain't no rich
there's
people.
not.
And they're
They
never
live in the
having-
next town.
they live up the road somewhere
Yeah.
now, and there were some fairly affluent parts of the town. We lived in the edges of them, around them, and it's basically an Afro-American town. The population is overwhelmingly black, and it has always been that way. Sawmill labor was there, all plantations all around. Saturday night, people came from the country to get paid off, and they partied. And Will Haney made a lot of money. So one of the reasons for that, I think, is that outside population. And that began to disappear by the 50s. Cotton was no longer king. And there's one cotton gin in the whole parish over there now, when there used to be dozens of them. And the rural areas are mostly empty. Mechanized, and populations displaced again, wound up in Ferriday and Natchez. So it's an interesting place. The history of the place is pretty short. It started about 1900, and it's quite different from places all around it that have been there since colonial times. But it's a special place.
It is, and you have to be there. I know for me, you have to be there a while to really understand that what's in the soil there, because you've heard that said, there's something in the water, there's something in the soil. Well, I found it to be true for me. I mean, I'm a lifelong musician, but there's really something about place. There's really something about those that went before you that leaves something behind, and there's a lot that's been left there in the soil at Ferriday. And so I'm proud to be there. I really am, and the community is really proud. I mean, they worked on getting that entertainment district done, and so with this next generation coming on has some energy, which is what you need to get something done. And so we've got the entertainment district. We're in the second phase of redoing the arcade theater, new exhibits at the museum. So I'm encouraged.
You gonna put the arcades back on the arcade? Did you ever see a picture of the old arcade theater?
I'm not sure I have.
Well, the old arcade theater was a big old brick building and it had brick arcades all the way across it. And, you know, I remember because when I was a little kid, came out of the movie and couldn't see. It was bright and I walked into the arcade and hit my head. There's no arcade here now.
Well,
But
sounds like to me,
it had a big brick facade with the arcades. It was pretty cool. A lot of terrazzo tile floor. And the
still there.
oldest lawyer in town had his office in the arcade theater.
wow.
And the name was Bullis. And the Bullis law office was in there. So I hope, Sean, you can keep Ferriday going and the museum.
I'm not sure I can take that pressure, but
Yeah, you could. Yeah, you're there now.
I do love it.
You're
I
there
really
now,
do.
and we got you hooked there, and I hope you stay and have a good time.
I'm not going anywhere. It's the greatest retirement job in the world. It really is. I get to talk music all day long and
Yeah, well,
get to interact with folks like yourself.
well, come
Doctor.
back over and see us.
I'll do it.
Okay.
Thank you for your time today, man. I
Thank
really
you very much for coming. You guys go to Ferriday.